The spring of 1885 brought wagon trains through the Nebraska Territory, carrying hopeful families west toward promised land and new beginnings. But for Jake Morrison, a 33-year-old rancher riding home from selling cattle in Omaha, that spring would bring something far more important than commerce. A young woman abandoned by her own family, unable to speak but desperate to be heard, whose silence would teach him that the deepest communication happens without words, and that sometimes the most eloquent love stories are written without a single spoken phrase. Jake had been running the Prairie Wind Ranch alone for 6 years, ever since his father died and left him 3,000 acres of prime Nebraska grassland, 200 head of cattle, and the crushing responsibility of building something lasting from the foundation they'd started together. At 33, Jake was respected throughout the territory as a fair dealer and an honest man, someone whose handshake meant more than most people's written contracts. But despite his success and his reputation, Jake's life was fundamentally solitary. Long days of hard work followed by lonely evenings in an empty house that felt more like a place where he slept between tasks than an actual home. He told himself he preferred the solitude, that dealing with people meant complications and disappointments, that isolation was simpler than the messy business of relationships and family. But on a warm May afternoon when Jake was riding home through the endless prairie, everything he'd convinced himself about preferring to be alone was shattered by a discovery that would change his life forever. Jake spotted an abandoned wagon sitting motionless in the middle of the prairie, its canvas torn and supplies scattered in the grass as if the occupants had left in desperate hurry or been driven away by force. Jake approached cautiously, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle, expecting bandits, hostile natives, or worse. The frontier had taught him that abandoned wagons rarely meant anything good. What he found behind the wagon made his heart clench with unexpected emotion and immediate protective fury. A young woman sat huddled in the tall grass, maybe 23 or 24, with long blonde hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like spun gold and blue eyes that held a mixture of terror, exhaustion, and desperate hope. She wore a simple pioneer dress that had once been respectable, but now showed signs of hard travel and rough treatment, and when she saw Jake approaching on his horse, she scrambled to her feet with the jerky movements of someone pushed beyond endurance. The woman opened her mouth as if to call out, to explain, to ask for help, but no sound emerged except a frustrated, anguished whimper that spoke of vocal cords that simply didn't work the way they should. She tried again, her face contorting with effort and desperation, her hands moving to her throat in the universal gesture of someone who cannot speak. And Jake understood immediately what made this situation even more heartbreaking than simple abandonment. The woman was mute. "Easy now," Jake said gently, dismounting slowly and keeping his movements non-threatening as he approached. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm guessing someone left you here because—" He gestured to his own throat, not wanting to complete the cruel sentence. The woman's face crumpled with a mixture of relief at being found and shame at the reason she'd been abandoned. She nodded desperately, then began making frantic gestures, pointing to wagon tracks leading west, holding up fingers to indicate numbers, touching her throat repeatedly, and finally covering her face with her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. And that's when you realize this isn't just about finding an abandoned woman. It's about two people discovering that sometimes the most profound connections happen when words fail, and hearts must find other ways to speak. Which is exactly why you should hit that subscribe button right now, because watching how this cowboy and mute woman learn to communicate through something deeper than language will prove that love doesn't need words to be understood, and that the most eloquent conversations happen in silence. Jake watched the woman's desperate attempts to communicate, seeing intelligence and determination in her efforts despite the obvious frustration of being unable to form words. "Can you write?" he asked, pulling paper and a pencil from his saddlebag, tools he carried for keeping records during cattle sales. The woman's face lit up with profound relief as she took the pencil with shaking hands and began writing in careful, educated script that immediately told Jake she was far more than just a frontier woman who happened to be unable to speak. Her handwriting was refined, her spelling perfect, and her words chose themselves with the precision of someone who had learned to make every written word count because spoken ones would never come. "My name is Grace Wellington," she wrote. "I was traveling with the Patterson wagon train heading to Oregon. My family hid my muteness when we joined the group, but 2 weeks ago someone discovered I cannot speak. The other travelers became afraid. They said a woman who cannot call for help or warn of danger is too much liability. They pressured my own parents to leave me behind. My father chose the wagon train over his daughter. Thank you for stopping. Most people wouldn't help someone like me." Jake read her words and felt rage building at the cruelty of people who would abandon someone for something completely beyond their control, and at parents who would choose social acceptance over their own child. "Grace, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you that needs fixing or apologizing for. You're coming with me to my ranch. I've got a big house that's too empty. I could use help managing the household, and I'll pay you fair wages for honest work, private quarters, complete respect, and anyone who has a problem with you not speaking will answer to me personally before they bother you about it." Grace stared at him with the wary assessment of someone who had learned the hard way that initial kindness often transformed into something darker once the reality of her disability became inconvenient. She wrote quickly, "Why would you help me? You don't know me. I can't call for help if there's danger, can't warn you if something's wrong, can't even tell you if I'm hurt or sick unless you happen to be looking at me. The wagon train was right. I am a liability." "The wagon train was wrong," Jake said firmly. "You're a person who deserves dignity and opportunity regardless of whether you can speak. And I'm guessing you've developed other ways to communicate that work just fine if people bother to pay attention. Come with me, Grace. Let me prove that not everyone judges people's worth by the sounds they can or cannot make." But you haven't seen the most important part yet. The first weeks following Grace's arrival at Prairie Wind Ranch opened Jake's eyes to how little he'd actually been listening, despite having perfect hearing. Grace couldn't speak, but she was brilliant at finding other ways to express herself, through writing notes that she left around the house, through gestures so nuanced and expressive they conveyed entire conversations, through facial expressions that communicated more genuine emotion than most people's carefully chosen words ever managed. More importantly, Grace brought skills and intelligence to the ranch that had absolutely nothing to do with her ability to speak. She reorganized Jake's chaotic household with impressive efficiency, transforming his bachelor chaos into something that actually functioned as a home rather than just a place where he ate and slept between work. She cooked meals that tasted incredible because she focused entirely on smell, texture, and appearance without the distraction of conversation. She mended his clothing with neat, careful stitches that lasted years rather than weeks. But what truly amazed Jake was Grace's almost supernatural ability with animals. Horses that spooked at loud noises and cattle that stampeded at sudden sounds seemed to calm instantly under Grace's patient, silent handling. She would approach nervous livestock with slow, deliberate movements, her hands gentle but confident, her entire presence radiating a calm that seemed to communicate directly with something deeper than their ears. "How do you do that?" Jake asked one evening, watching Grace successfully handle a mare that had been refusing all attempts at training since Jake bought her 3 months earlier. "That horse was ready to kick anyone who came near her, but she's standing there letting you brush her like your old friends." Grace pulled out the small notebook she now carried everywhere and wrote, "Animals don't need words. They need patience, consistency, and someone who listens to what they're trying to communicate through their body language and behavior. I've been listening to things that don't speak my whole life. When you can't rely on words, you learn to pay attention to everything else. How someone stands, how they move, what their eyes are saying. Animals communicate constantly. Most people just don't bother to listen because they're too focused on talking." Jake studied her face as she wrote, seeing intelligence and perception that most people would never notice if they dismissed her because of her silence. "I'm starting to realize you probably understand people and animals better than those of us who talk all the time. We're so busy filling silence with words that we forget to actually pay attention to what's being communicated in other ways." Grace smiled, a genuine expression of joy that lit up her entire face, and wrote, "Most people hear my silence and assume emptiness, like a room with no one in it. You hear my silence and assume there's something worth understanding, like a book waiting to be read. That's why I feel safer here in 6 weeks than I felt in 23 years with my family." The observation touched something deep in Jake's chest, making him realize that his own isolation hadn't been about preferring solitude. It had been about not finding anyone who understood that silence could be companionable rather than awkward, that not every moment needed filling with noise and conversation. Wait. Don't miss what happens next. As summer progressed and Grace settled more deeply into ranch life, Jake found himself watching for her smiles, learning to read her expressions with the same attention she paid to everything around her, and discovering that conversation without words could be more honest and intimate than anything he'd experienced with women who spoke constantly but said nothing of substance. Grace, for her part, discovered that Jake's consistent kindness wasn't pity masquerading as charity. It was genuine respect for who she was rather than frustration about what she couldn't do. He never tried to fix her, never suggested she was less valuable because she couldn't speak, never treated her silence as a problem needing solution. He simply accepted her exactly as she was and found ways to communicate that worked for both of them. They developed their own language, a combination of her written notes, expressive gestures, and the kind of intuitive understanding that comes when two people actually pay attention to each other, instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Jake learned that Grace's smile meant different things depending on whether it reached her eyes, that she had specific gestures for common household questions, and that her handwriting changed subtly when she was tired, happy, worried, or excited. The turning point in their relationship came during a late summer storm when lightning spooked the horses, and Grace went to calm them despite the danger of being in the barn during an electrical storm. Jake found her standing in the middle of a dozen nervous horses that should have been panicking, but were instead pressing close to her, seeking comfort from her calm presence in the midst of chaos. "You're incredible," Jake said, not caring that thunder made his words barely audible. "You're the most capable person I've ever known, and every day I spend with you I realize how much I was missing by living alone, convinced that isolation was preferable to the complications of caring about someone." Grace turned to look at him, and even in the dim barn light illuminated only by occasional lightning flashes, Jake could see understanding in her eyes, not just comprehension of his words, but recognition of the emotion behind them. She walked toward him slowly, pulled out her notebook with hands that trembled slightly, and wrote, "I'm falling in love with you, Jake Morrison. I know I'm not what men usually want, a woman who can't speak, who can't call your name when you're in another room, who can't tell you she loves you out loud or speak marriage vows that anyone can hear. But my heart speaks even if my voice doesn't, and my heart is saying you're everything I'd stopped hoping existed." Jake felt his breath catch as he read her words, seeing more honesty and vulnerability on that page than he'd encountered in all the spoken conversations he'd ever had with women who told him what they thought he wanted to hear rather than what they genuinely felt. "Grace, you can tell me you love me. Maybe not with words, but every smile, every gesture, every time you look at me like I'm worth looking at instead of just another obligation, those tell me more than words ever could. I love you too, not despite your silence, but because you've taught me that the most important things don't need words to be understood." Their first kiss was tender and profound. Two people discovering that communication happens in countless ways that have nothing to do with speech, and that sometimes the deepest intimacy comes from being truly seen and understood rather than just heard. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what comes next. The proposal came naturally during autumn when the prairie turned gold, and Grace had been at the ranch for 8 months. Jake didn't plan it as a grand romantic gesture. Instead, he simply realized one morning that he couldn't imagine his life without her, and decided that waiting for some perfect moment was stupid, when every moment with Grace was already perfect in its own way. Instead of kneeling with a ring and spoken words, Jake handed Grace her notebook and pencil, then did something he'd never done before. He wrote his own message in his rough, unpracticed handwriting. "Marry me. Be my wife. my partner, the person who taught me that silence can be louder than words and that love doesn't need language to be real and lasting. Grace read his awkward handwriting. He was much better with ranch accounts than romantic notes, and laughed, a sound she could make even if words wouldn't come, a pure expression of joy that needed no translation. She took the pencil and wrote her response in her careful script. Yes. Yes to building a life together where we communicate in all the ways that matter most. Yes to showing the world that families are built on understanding rather than conversation. Yes to everything you're offering and everything I have to give in return. The wedding took place with minimal guests, just a few neighbors who had learned to value Grace for her capabilities rather than judge her for her limitations, and a traveling preacher who was initially uncertain about marrying a woman who couldn't speak her vows aloud, until Jake explained that Grace would write her vows, and he would read them as her voice. When the preacher asked if Jake took Grace as his wife, his spoken vows were also written down, so Grace could read them later and know exactly what he'd promised. I take this woman, who taught me that listening matters infinitely more than speaking, that silence can be sacred rather than awkward, and that the deepest connections happen when we stop trying to fill every moment with noise. I promise to learn your language as you've learned mine, to value what you give rather than mourn what you can't, and to spend my life proving that you deserve to be loved and cherished exactly as you are. Grace's written vows were read aloud by Jake at her request, his voice carrying her words across the small gathering. I take this man who found me abandoned by people who should have protected me and saw value instead of burden, who learned to hear what I couldn't say and speak in ways I could understand, who proved that being unable to speak doesn't mean being unable to love or be loved. I promise to fill your life with the kind of communication that matters most: loyalty, respect, devotion, and understanding that needs no words to be real and lasting. Years passed, and Prairie Wind Ranch became known throughout Nebraska Territory, not just for Jake's successful cattle operation, but for Grace's remarkable ability with animals, and for being a place where people learned that disability didn't equal inability, that silence could be strength, and that the most important conversations often happened without any words at all. They raised 3 children who grew up bilingual in a unique way, speaking with their father and writing with their mother, learning young that communication had countless forms, and that their mother's silence held more wisdom than most people's endless talking. The children never thought of their mother as disabled or limited. They simply knew she communicated differently, and they became remarkably perceptive about reading people's true intentions through behavior rather than just accepting words at face value. On their 10th anniversary, watching Grace teach their youngest daughter to gentle a nervous colt using patience and silent communication rather than loud commands and force, Jake reflected on the day he'd found her abandoned in the prairie. Do you ever regret that you can't speak? Wish you could say my name out loud or tell the children bedtime stories with your voice? Grace pulled out her ever-present notebook and wrote, I used to wish that constantly. Before you, silence felt like loss and limitation, but you taught me it's just a different way of being heard, and sometimes a better one because it requires people to actually pay attention instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. Our children understand me perfectly. You know what I'm thinking before I write it down. And I've learned that I love you means infinitely more when you show it every single day through actions and attention than when you just say it with words that cost nothing and prove nothing. She paused, then added, Besides, I can still tell you I love you, just not with my voice. She put down the notebook and took Jake's weathered face in her hands, looking into his eyes with an intensity and tenderness that communicated everything that needed saying, and Jake understood perfectly. Some conversations happen in complete silence and say more than words ever could. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the deepest connections happen when we truly listen rather than just waiting to speak, and that love needs no words to be understood when it's expressed through action and attention, then you've found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Romance Stories for more tales of unexpected connections, unconventional communication, and love that transcends the limitations society tries to place on what's possible. From prairie abandonments to family celebrations, every story we tell proves that the most eloquent love stories are sometimes written without a single spoken word, and that the greatest gift we can give another person is being truly heard regardless of how they choose to communicate.